Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Eggs. Today's guest is Jason Treu. Jason is an executive business coach who works with leaders, entrepreneurs, and rising startups to maximize their leadership potential and performance. With more than 45,000 copies sold, he's the best selling author of Social Wealth, a how to guide on building an extraordinary business. Jason also hosts a podcast himself called Executive Breakthroughs, where game changing CEOs, entrepreneurs, and other experts are invited to share their breakthroughs and breakdowns. In 2017, Jason was featured at TEDxWilmington, where he debuted his breakthrough team building game, Cards Against Mundanity. Or Mundanity, I guess. I'm messing it up.
Mundanity, but close
Mundanity.
enough.
Sorry about that. Jason works with leading organizations such as Google, Amazon, Southwest, Microsoft, Oracle, and many others. He helps his clients build and execute a career blueprint that teaches them the best methods of improving leadership and management from within the business. His ultimate goal is for his clients to build their highest performing teams and their most engaged employees. So, without any further ado, allow me to introduce Jason Treu. Hey, Jason, how are you?
Hey, well, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for making time to do this. We really appreciate you.
Great, no problem.
Cool. Yeah. Well, let's start off, I guess, then just with a little bit of background. Jason, can you tell us a little bit about you, where you come from, and what you do?
Sure. So I live in Dallas, Texas now. I've lived on both coasts. I went to law school and got my master's in communications at Syracuse University, and then I headed west to the gold rush and startup world. And I got to work with Steve Jobs, Mark Cuban, Reed Hastings, the current CEO of Netflix. I got to, a lot of other pretty well-known, famous CEOs, venture capitalists, private equity people, on and onward. So it's, and then, I moved to Dallas and I was working at HP. And while I was doing that, I decided that, I wanted to see if I could get a side hustle started up. And I started off really small. I'd been very successful coming here and figuring out how to meet people and raise money for charities and nonprofit organizations. And so I had a book that I thought in my head was How to Build a Social Life in 30 Days or Less. And it's about building relationships. And I figured if it were successful, I could branch that off in the business side of things, because essentially a business isn't a business without the people. So there was definitely a ramp there I saw, and sort of went on that journey, wrote Social Wealth that's done really well, and now just work with leaders, managers, and organizations on a whole host of leadership management, team performance, and building challenges.
So in my research, I think I saw that you got a degree in English, or is that the communications degree that you?
Well, it's communications, my master's, but an undergrad, I probably I got like 5 minors or something, so I was overly ambitious.
So did you always have an interest in like startups and businesses, or was it more kind of like you just?
It's a learning. I think it's the learning part of it, and it's a learning and growth function. And so in the startup world and mentality, obviously that's at the highest level, along with creativity, innovation. And so for me, that is someplace that is really interesting.
Sure.
Yeah. So how did you make that shift then? So most people, go into education or go into school for whatever it is they hope to do in the future. How did you stumble into business as an English major, or one of many majors?
Yeah, well, it's just something that I like problems and solutions. And it was just one of those things where I think I found more of the industry and then figured it out from there. And I always like being on the cutting edge. And so, technology back when I was in grad school, which is probably the late 90s, was just something that was really heating up. So the chance to go to Silicon Valley and be in a place that was doing cutting edge things across the world, to me was just something that, was in my hotspot. That was like, that's me. So yeah, that resonated with me. And so then I decided that, all right, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to figure it out, more than I went in with a specific plan of here's what I'm going to do and here's what I want to get out of it. I just jumped in and with 2 feet and said, I know that I'll be able to swim because this is the right place for me.
Sure. Well, so a couple things on that. So, one of the kind of the trends, I guess, in business these days, not that it hasn't been forever, but is, people's I mean, the power of the MBA, right? That seems to be the thing. Everybody wants their MBA in business and all that stuff. And here you are, somebody coming from a different background entirely. What do you think the value is of the MBA you go get from a school versus the MBA you earn by just jumping in head first, like you did?
Well, I think today the reason to get an MBA is a network. And so if you're not going to a school that is going to provide you with a network like Harvard, Stanford, or whatever, you really need to rethink that, unless your job requires that to get ahead and you're going to get more money, or there's a specific function that you don't understand that it's going to help you learn and cover. Because I think going and doing things and experiencing and all the free things online today, you can cobble together enough education. And the experience, end of the day, trumps everything else, because how it works in school is not how it works in the real world. Like, for instance, when I went to law school, when I went to work as a lawyer and doing something like in the summer and other things, I had to work the exact opposite of what I was doing in school, right? I mean, the way I wrote a brief was like 180-degree opposite. So in fact, school didn't help me at all. In fact, it actually hindered me, because I thought I actually knew what I was supposed to do. And then I realized I knew nothing. And I had essentially learned it all over again. And I find that way in business too, because the rules that you learn in school are not in the real world. And the people that are teaching those classes are not the people that are CEOs of a company, obviously, because they can't be in two places at one time. And so I find that you just got to get out and do it and learn and immerse yourself in the information, and then, spend time getting coaching, doing research and testing things as you're doing it. But that's an entrepreneurial journey. I think that's today's business journey.
Yeah. And so, and I guess to your point, I mean, this idea of, that you could go online and cobble together some kind of, I don't know, makeshift MBA, the experience learned and being able to bring on coaching and things like that for specific needs that are addressing problems you're running into in business in any given moment is probably much more valuable than general information that you would pull out of a school.
Yeah, because for instance, stuff I'm doing on team building and performance is not in any college or university.
Yeah.
In fact, it's actually back asswards, right? And so they're learning the exact opposite. And so that's the problem. They're not learning self-awareness the right way in, any university setting. In fact, if you look at business networking, it actually is pretty much done incorrectly at every school. When I talk to people about how they're teaching their own MBA students to network, I'm like, that's not how you get to successful people and actually build a relationship with them, right? And so none of these things are really being taught, because, no offense, the people teaching them in general, they aren't experts in this. They aren't mastering the actual experience level thing. They know the research exceptionally well, and they're collecting the data, but they're not on the cutting edge of living it every day.
They're not out making the data.
No, yeah. And so, there are exceptions to that.
Sure.
But I don't think is a full breadth of an education. You're going in every semester, and, out of every 5-6 classes you have, there are probably one or less teachers that are actually living it, not just talking about it.
No, and I think that that's a really interesting insight. I mean, back to the point you made a moment ago about just the value of school could really be that network versus the education you get there, because you've got to go out and learn everything anyway. That's a perspective I hadn't heard before. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think today with college and stuff like that with parents, I mean, I really think it is this way. If you're like your son or daughter is not getting in a top 10 school, you really need to think the cost benefit analysis of what they're doing, because the network at Harvard is why you pay for Harvard, not the education, because you're just learning things that you could learn elsewhere. But the people you have access to, you can't get everywhere else. And so that's worth a tremendous amount of money, right? Because that network is right at your fingertips, literally, outside your dorm room and walking around. But if you're going to school that's maybe a really good state school that you're paying or something a lot of money for, you got to really rethink, like, what is it that you're getting out of this, and what's the real benefit on the education and network standpoint versus the cost and debt level that you're going to have, and the pressure you are to recoup that, and how employers look at that education today.
Yeah, a lot of it's all portfolio based these days, where if you have a good, if especially in the tech industry, if you can come out and show the work that you've already done, that says a lot more than necessarily saying, I went to Idaho State University. You got the degree, but what's it really worth?
Yeah, and you're seeing also most of those tech and coding schools, half of the education now is in soft skills.
Yeah.
Because they realize that the problem is from an engineer and a coding person isn't their skill sets alone, it's their inability to interact, communicate, collaborate, resolve conflicts, be empathetic to people inside the organization from all levels and from customers and prospects and everywhere else, which is a key piece of your job, right? It's not learning and knowledge itself. It's how do you apply it and engage with other people. So I think that as we see these skills become much more important, as they're eroding from our process of growing up and we're lacking them, I think that's another reason why, investments in these areas are pretty much paramount to being successful.
Sure. So what was your first job or gig in the Silicon kind of world when you moved out there? What did you land on?
Yeah, well, what I wanted to do initially was I wanted to go to an agency, and I went to a marketing agency because I could have my fingertips in a lot of different clients, a lot of different industries, and really learn a lot and have that be advantageous because I didn't really know necessarily, who were all the hot companies, what were all the industries. And that way I could be a jack of all trade and kind of dabble in a lot of different things and just learn. And then I could decide to plunge into something specific. And I thought that could afford me that opportunity. So I really wanted to look for a small or medium-sized agency that I could get into that would be really hungry and aggressive with a lot of smart people. Because, at that point in my life, I realized that if you're around those types of people, odds are success was going to be forthcoming. And, I was fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, that's common. It's good to have that network built up and you kind of, use that to your advantage and move on from there.
Yep.
Well, so in your experience, Jason, so, not to keep beating the education horse, but I wanted to just ask you, so, I mean, if education's not where it's at for your average entrepreneur or whatever, I think most people would argue it's grit or it comes from something inside you where you're sort of driven to do things entrepreneurial. Where in your life did that drive come from? Like, did you have inspiration in family or something that were already in business, or was it just something in you that sort of made you curious, and so you just sort of always chase those things?
Yeah, I think my mom always instilled in me early on the value of education and learning and just really being uncomfortable and getting out of your comfort zone. And I think the other thing is because I was an only child growing up and my parents got divorced and my mom was a nurse anesthesiologist and she was working quite a bit, like a lot of 24-hour shifts. So I was, essentially on my own after the age of 12 years old. And my mom was gone 3 or 4 nights a week and there were no family friends. I didn't have any brothers or sisters, or I didn't have any family. So when you start fending for yourself, you realize that, you have to make the human connections. And it wasn't like I was calling people on my phone because I didn't have one. I had to go visit them. So being an extrovert was a requirement to having human connection. So I think that spurred myself on. So I think a lot of that is just a love of people. And then the other part is I went to a Jesuit high school, and regardless of religious affiliation, I'm not really that religious myself, but our motto was being a man for others. And so it really put a contribution mindset in what you were doing. And if you didn't have that, all the rest really didn't matter. And the school really stressed that. So I think those influences really shaped the direction of my life over time and got me to where I am today.
Sure. How far into your career were you when you wrote your book, Social Wealth?
Pretty far. I didn't have any entrepreneurial, I would say, idols or people close to my life. So I think the belief in that I could do it wasn't there. And although really, I think there's obviously that's all made up and it's a story, right? And it's a very fine line between saying you can do it and not. I guess inside, I always thought I needed someone else or someone else was better at it than me for whatever reason. So I really did that at that point because I was working with someone else and the partnership was going down the drain. And it was a way for me to push myself and pretty much put a stake in the ground and have to do it. And so I decided that was just something that I had to do.
Yeah. How long did it take to write? Do you have any editors or, talk about the process of writing the book?
Yeah, it took me probably about a year to write the book from start to finish because I did a lot of testing and things and talked to a lot of people. And every time I got somewhere, I found some other road I wanted to go down. And I also tried to find other books and see where the holes were. So I did a lot of work, and I did have an editor, and I really looked for an editor. I tried to find someone from one of the big editing houses that had been in the room, but was really young and hungry and I could afford, and had just gotten out and was like in their late 20s. And I had all these parameters written down, and I really looked to find those people, and there were very few of them that I actually had found. And then that was really helpful because I got a lot of helpful pieces of advice and what to do. And I got an editing job that was far superior than I could have gotten for any amount of money. And and then the marketing part of it is hard. And I found some people now that are really well known doing the marketing. And I was really looking for people who are young, hungry, and trying to be aggressive. And that was very helpful too, because that's something I think people miss, is that a good piece of the book is the marketing and sales and promotion of it that you have to do yourself.
Yeah.
And how to go about doing that when you're an unknown author and don't have some major brand equity. So that was also a huge other learning curve and journey.
Well, it's funny because like I'm hearing a lot of parallels between your story and my story, actually. So this is really interesting to me. So, but one of the things you mentioned in writing your book was that, even though you always had sort of, I guess, in some circles, they call it like an imposter syndrome or something, where you maybe don't believe that you're the right guy to be delivering this product, and so,
Yes.
but nonetheless, you fought through it and you did your book, and sort of put that stake in the ground. Was that about the time that you shifted into doing executive coaching and things like that?
It was.
It seems like becoming an executive coach indicates that you seem to believe in yourself and have a firm understanding of who you are and where you are and what you have to offer. But that doesn't sound like the guy who's unsure about publishing a book. So I just wonder if it kind of happened in the same time.
It happened about the same time. And I think one of the challenges that I had overcome at that point too was a lot of self-awareness issues and how to do behavioral change things. Because as I had done some coaching with this other person and, how to do social life, and a lot of it was geared at that time towards men, I realized that I had to learn on how to shift people from the inside out, sort of rapid mini therapy with people that I could get like 90% of the people to make rapid behavioral changes and mindset and other shifts and be able to do it the way a therapist would in like a tenth of the time.
Right.
And so I went out and found people that were exceptional people to do this. And now that are on Oprah and really well known and got personal coaching and group coaching to try to understand their mindset and how that they were doing this in order to bring in a business to help the people that I was helping. Because I found that as I was doing things, the issue wasn't necessarily the external things I was teaching people, but the challenges they were having internally with their blind spots, past patterns that were going in their life, mental models, limiting beliefs, false narratives that were hurting their ability to get results. And so sometimes the results were inconsistent. And I realized that when I did all that, obviously I did my own soul searching and journey, right? I mean, it goes hand in hand, because if you can't teach someone something you don't have. So it required me to do all that work and dig in my accountability mirror. And so I think when I got through that, I realized that I had everything really put together to start something and then to continue down that journey's path, over the course of my life. So
Sure. Well, yeah, no, I mean, that makes complete sense. And I mean, tell me if any of this sort of rings true for you. But I mean, like for me in business and in everything else, like, getting my start and just being a hard worker and developing a skill or whatever, like that was no problem for me. And it's funny that you were in agency business, because so was I. And so, the hard work component was never it. But as I've progressed in my career and as I've started to transition my own company, which we still do a lot of marketing and advertising work, I've found that in order to be a good leader, I've had to step up and I've had to try and be, have an opinion and things like that, that when I was a younger, budding art director or designer, I could get away with not having like a strong opinion.
Yes.
Just take the feedback from the client and do the job. And that was it. And I was very good at it, but like, not a standout. Yet when I took this job at an agency down here in Salt Lake City, I made sort of a mental bargain with myself that like the only way I was going to stand up and the only way I was going to, go through this, experience at the agency and sort of grow at the rate I wanted to grow, it was going to require me to sort of shift the way I was with people. Rather than being the quiet introvert and sitting behind my computer and designing all day, I was going to have to express an opinion, or I was going to have to start, being somebody people could turn to for advice or to help coach people through other situations. And as I've grown and gotten further and further in my career, I found that at some point there was a shift where I went from being the guy that wanted to be the producer and the quiet introvert that could just be left alone to design all day. And I shifted into this guy that now all I want to do is go out and meet people and talk to people and try and build stuff. And it's so out of character for me, like the old me, but at some point I made this transition. And what it feels like to me in your experience or in your story is something like that. And it's funny, I was an only child growing up and stuff too, so maybe there's something there. But it seems like there's some parallels there in sort of life experience where, in your case, you put a stake in the ground, you wrote the book, and that was the pivotal moment for you to really move forward. In my case, it was, some different business offerings and things like that, where I just had to be a big kid. I had to grow up and move out of this other phase. And now I barely even recognize the old me. And so I just was curious if that was sort of, your experience as well.
Yeah, and I think also the other piece of it is when you start to talk to people and breaking it down in my head, I've started to think about business in terms of when you're a frontline worker in something, you're looking for a problem in a solution, right? So you're in sales and you're like, okay, well, the deal is I got to sell more to increase revenue. So how do I do that? And as you go up to the next level, you're a manager, right? And you're managing other frontline people. So you're managing the chaos, right? And someone's handing you a playbook to execute. But as you go up higher and higher on the food chain, you're now the person writing the playbook. You're putting it all together. And when you're a frontline person, there's a problem. The solution is easier because when you get over quota, you did great. When you're writing the playbook, it's much more nuanced. You have to get trust with people. You've got to build relationships. You only see the finish line very rarely, and most of that takes months or years to see if anything you had been doing works, and a lot of it's on blind faith. So I think it's a natural progression, and I think it gets significantly harder because you don't have these easy markers per se to get to, right? You don't have the end of the quarter. The end of the quarter may be one thing, but you now have to build a business for the next 5 years, and you won't know until 5 years are up whether you did your investments and your thought process and strategies are really going to work. So, I think it's a natural evolution for people to go and to see that is the path they're going on. And so I think you saw that, and you probably saw that with a lot of different people and their successes and things you read and things you did, and then partly gut instinct, and then had gone on that journey to say, well, what I did then isn't enough anymore, because the requirement for building what I want is going to have to take me up to the place where I am writing the playbook and I'm writing what's happening next, not someone handing it to me anymore, like you were before.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Let's take a step back. Let's go back to completion of the book. You've got a product now. How do you go from that to 45,000 copies sold? I mean, that had to be, is that over 8 years? Is that over 2 years? What was your game plan?
That was probably over. It's about 60,000. It's probably, over 2-3 years of doing it. One of the things that was helpful in the book is that I read almost all the other business networking and business relationship books. And one of the things I thought to myself, if I'm super busy, I want to write the book short. I want to do a blueprint, because most of the books, and this is not to pick on the authors, but they're telling you a lot of stories, and I love stories. But the problem is I don't have 300 pages in me to read all those stories and come up with some conclusions. I'm like, if someone either believes me it's going to work or not, and if I'm giving them step-by-step instructions on what to do and I'm breaking it down for them, all they have to do is try it. And they don't have to buy anything more or purchase anything. All they have to do is get evidence. And if that's not enough for them, then this book isn't worth their time. But I think that's what helped it, is that I wrote it in a blueprint to take anyone from an introvert who was shy and worried and take them to the point where they can be successful on their terms, and take someone who's an extrovert to do that as well. and give them all the components and break it down for them. And I saw it was differentiated, that I could market it that way and say, look, you can get a book by, back then, like I like Keith Ferrazzi's book, Never Eat Alone. And I'm saying, well, you can buy his book and read 300 pages, or you can take mine and execute and build it. And you don't need to go and get anything from me ever again. You have to get a lot more from him to take this information and create what he has. Right. And so I think some of that stuff was pretty powerful, and it worked and it resonated with people. You know, and I made a lot of videos. I try to do stuff to help people along the way. And I built a decent network as well. And so that helped, but I also got a lot of reviews from people. The people that I met, one of them's Tyler Wagner, and he's got a successful business now doing it. And there's a couple other people that were part of it, really gave me some nuggets. And one of them was get reviews. And those are the hardest things to do right now. Even speaking, I go out and speak to people all the time and trying to get speaking reviews and speeding that process up. I mean, it's like pulling teeth even from people who are super excited, and you're getting great reviews. It doesn't even matter. It's still hard. So you just have to take a lot of time and patience to do that. And so I did everything I could to come out with a book and have, you know, about 50 reviews in the book before a day that it launched. And it made a big difference because there's a lot of social proof. You know, I wasn't paying anyone for them. I said, here's the book, or I'd do something for them and saying, hey, you know, I'd give them 30 minutes of coaching and saying, look, if you feel like it's worth it, do it. I'm not requiring you to, but I'd really appreciate it if you think there's value there, because other people won't know it, because I'm a small business person. I'm not a huge brand equity, you know, they'll never know it exists. And so without you, this won't work. And I just did that, and it worked. You know, I still had a lot of people I did things for that never wrote reviews, right? So it was pretty much 24/7 in some ways, marketing and doing a lot of this stuff in order to get it in a place where I was launching it, and that I could have enough social proof and make it up to try to get enough swings on Amazon to get up the lists for more people to see that I couldn't reach, and for them to take a chance and buy it or see it or do other stuff. So that's probably short story of a long journey of that. So
you mentioned Amazon. Is that do they do your printing and publishing and all that?
Yeah, it's just easier, because the problem is if you get on other sites, it just doesn't help, I think, your ranking and the rest of it and tracking it. And it really doesn't matter. Everyone runs through Amazon. And so it just, to me, was like, and they told me the same thing. It's like, why dilute your brand on multiple sites? Just put it on one. Regardless of how you feel about it.
When you get to those kind of numbers, do they give you a better break on the printing costs?
No, it's the same thing. You know, it's just, and a lot of those were ebooks that I did initially, because I didn't have the print version of the book. I just did the electronic, because I had no idea that it would do that well. I mean, I was like, okay, you know, why would I go through the print version? And then I put out the print version later as I got more and more requests for it. I was like, I have to do this. And then I did an audio book too when I launched it, and because there's a lot of audio people out there too, so that also helped. And
yeah, that's really cool. Well, and I think one of the things that probably makes your book really resonate with people is just, you know, you have this story, this sort of, I mean, it's, you know, almost a Cinderella story. The you know, introvert becomes the extrovert, and now the coach. You know, I mean, I think that so many people can resonate with that, you know, life, or sort of that model, you know. And I know that, like, one of the things that I struggled with for a long time was just like with age and getting older. You know, if you pay attention to any of these business coaches, or, you know, motivational guys or whatever, you know, the Gary Vaynerchuks of the world, everything they're pitching, you know, or the lion's share of it, is for kids coming out of college and 20-year-olds. And, you know, all you seem to see in the news are the, you know, billionaire 30-year-old guys that launched their tech company and things like that. And as you start to get older, and I'm just 39, but you know, as I'm getting a little bit older, you start to feel like, God, you know, now I'm making some things happen, but like they should have happened 20 years ago. Like I'm way behind the game, you know. And so I found myself, you know, often tearing myself down over that kind of thing. Just like, God, I'm really old to this. What am I doing? You know, I feel stupid because I didn't go to school the same way that some MBA did, and, you know, all these things. And so overcoming the confidence has been, you know, and building the confidence has been difficult. And one of the things that I did to try and overcome that was I came up with this idea that basically it took a lifetime of decisions to get to where I am today. So it's not like I could have made one decision that would have circumvented all of this. The only way to get here was by making all the decisions I've made over the last 39 years. And that sort of helped me put into perspective that, or at least allow myself to, or sort of forgive myself for not maybe going right into business college, but nonetheless, my life experiences have culminated into something awesome. And that's okay. Like, that's a good thing. And I think for a lot of people who, either feel insecure or feel, shy or introverted and things like that, a message like yours, or even to some extent one like what I'm experiencing now, to hear somebody who's kind of, I guess, overcome, not that it's, a disease or something that you fought through, but I mean, nonetheless, to be able to change your behavior. I think so many people are caught up thinking that there's no other way to be, that they just, kind of, I guess, just admit that this is what life is, and that's all I'm going to do.
Yes.
And so I think a book like yours must resonate with people, but I think that may also be why you get such great reviews. Is you're hitting people that maybe, and this is me speaking. I haven't read the book at this time, but I will. I imagine that when this book is hitting people, some of what's appealing to them, I mean, like you said, there's a million business books out there. I mean, you can find books on just about any subject under the sun, but like part of how your story might resonate with people might be that you're hitting on this emotional chord. And it seems like that may be kind of, part of your focus anyway, in terms of developing relationships and building relationships with people. Sharing your story is probably one of the most powerful things you do, but I think that also leads to people who have an emotional bond with you versus you just being another business coach.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is that we're all emotional creatures, right? And cognition and behavior are in the backseat, and they're the passengers, and logic along with it. And I think people always get that messed up because people that they claim they're not emotional, they always say I'm very logical, but they get their truth mixed up with beliefs, right? The truth is 1 + 1 = 2. Everyone watching this and listening to this will say that that's obvious, but you can see one set of events one way compared to someone else, right? You might look at the sky and it's cloudy outside, and someone might see some sun coming through and saying, hey, it's partly sunny, and someone might say it's partly cloudy. Well, neither one of you are wrong, but neither one of you are necessarily right. It's a belief you're having. It's not the truth. And so end of the day, emotions are really running all of us and our viewpoints and how we see things. And I think once we embrace that, we don't have to be right. We don't have to be perfect, right? We just try to do the best job that we can. And the key thing is meeting people, building relationships, and moving things forward, right? And, and your journey, it's common. Everyone, I think more and more people at this point are changing jobs, changing careers in their 30s and 40s. And it's a constant learning process and evolution. And the people that learn earlier on, I was the same way, thinking, geez, I wish I would have done all that stuff back then. But there's so many people then have those experiences and feel false confidence. They have false beliefs and they get overconfident. And what ends up happening is they fall off a cliff, right? Their ego comes in. It happens all the time.
Well, and that makes sense, right? I mean, if you step into your career thinking you're, top dog and you really understand all this stuff, and then, like you said, even in your own experience, you walk in and you find out you know nothing, then, it's, I mean, that probably is a little bit harder hit than somebody that was insecure and sort of felt like they didn't understand it anyway, but we're going in to learn.
Yeah, I mean, it really happens a lot. I mean, you'll rarely see successful people have multiple businesses in a row that have done well, significantly well. Because usually the overconfidence will get them to start making some mistakes, and they'll think they're smarter than everyone around them. They won't get coaching. They'll stop learning. They'll stop investing themselves. They'll stop testing things, and they'll hit a precipitous fall. And then the other thing is their self-awareness too, because 90 to 95% or 95% of people think they're self-aware, but only 10 to 15% of people are. And end of the day, that's where your blind spots, past patterns, and everything hit you. And you misnavigate things, you misjudge them, you emotionally are incorrect about navigating the landscape and people you're dealing with. All these things come into play, which ends up cratering you and bringing you to your knees, and people going bankrupt, their companies blowing up after they hit successes. So people like Bill Gates having 2 things in a row that have been wildly successful are very rare in this world today, right? I mean, it's just not something that people end up doing. And I think there are a lot of reasons why, but people don't really necessarily learn those lessons. So I think that starting later has the advantage of experience and feeling all the things that you talked about, which also help you get over that hurdle, because you realize that in order for me to do that as a person, I'm going to have to look into my own accountability mirror and my own self-awareness and deal with those things to take the next step up. And I think that's something that once you learn it, you can continually doing it, but most people never do. And it ends up bringing them to their knees, both personally and professionally. And even when it does, they don't really seek out help and they don't really seek out answers. They just blame other people and blame circumstances in the world around them and life. And, you know, instead of taking responsibility and accountability for their part in it, and what could I have done different? How can I change things moving forward? And what am I not seeing?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's really astute. I think, and maybe this is a good time to transition into this. So one of the things that you set forth is sort of these 10 essential leadership skill sets. Do you mind going into that a little bit and kind of breaking down each of those things? I think we've covered a couple of them just in conversation as we've been working through, but if you don't mind, let's talk about sort of this top 10 list and how people can achieve them.
Is that broken down more in your book too? So if people
yeah, there are different ones that go into it. I mean, and some of the things have changed too since I've written the book, and things that, you know, I think about things. Like, I think that, you know, one of the key things is really just listening. And because I think listening leads to more empathy, because one of the biggest things I find that problematic today with leaders and managers and people in business is they want people to be in a certain place that they're not currently at. And you got to meet people where they're at, not where you want them to be. And I think that's a huge issue that goes on, because there'll be managers and leaders coming to me saying things about their employees, and also employees talking about their horrendous boss. And a lot of times what happens, these are all false narratives and stories that they've made up in their head, and they've never had a real conversation with that person to talk about what's going on, and then be open and listen to it and say to themselves, I could be willing to be wrong about my judgments, about the stories, about everything else I had about that person. And then also putting yourselves in that shoe, right? Because if you have a boss that you hate, you got to realize that that person probably has 3, 4, 5, 6 direct reports. They could be managing a lot of business. They could be under a lot of pressure. They could be having home life problems, right? There's a lot of stuff that could come in and say why they're irritated with you or annoyed. It may have nothing to do with you, but a lot of people assume that it is, and they make up that story, and they never have these conversations.
Sure.
But I think when you start to dig deeper, you create opportunities for communication, collaboration, and for just understanding where someone is and respecting their journey and understanding it, so you can better interact and engage with them, even if it's at a point where all you can do is get to neutral. I mean, that serves you significantly better than if you're in a situation where you dislike someone, because when you dislike someone, you're not fully engaged and you're not working your capabilities. So you're undermining your own success and you're hurting yourself because you're not fully showing up. And so it hurts both ends of things. And so I think that's one thing, as I'm trying to talk to people and learn from them and also teach them, is that's a significant skill that people lack today, and you see it showing up all over the place.
So is there a point where you could actually share too much? I mean, there's got to be stuff you got to kind of keep on the DL and not really. How do you know, like what to share and what not to share? I mean,
yeah, I think, you do have to monitor what goes on, I think, in your own head to people. But I do think you have to open up, especially if you have power. If you're the person who's the manager talking to the employee, you have a lot more leeway. And I think the point of it is if you share with those people what's going on, obviously, oversharing is bad, right? And being negative. But I think letting people know where you're at is an important thing, because you open the door. Because when you're vulnerable with someone else, the key thing is it tells them it's safe to share with you.
Yeah. I've been listening to a book. I think it's called Lost and Founder by Rand Fishkin.
Okay.
And he's actually in the book. He talks about how he shares his financials with his employees. He's like, "Hey, this is where we're sitting. If we don't get from here to here, we're gonna have to let a few of you go. We're gonna have to do this. We're gonna have to do that." And he said that by doing that and actually breaking down the numbers and showing them to the employees instead of kind of just like letting them assume, that they actually, you know, their work ethic changes. They do this and they do that
Yes.
based off of, hey, we know that, you know, our ass is on the line if we don't perform, and then they take ownership for it, which is important and critical, I think.
Yeah, Ray Dalio does that with that's how he built his hedge fund and be the biggest hedge fund in the world. Bridgewater Capital is through like it's massive candor. I mean, he pretty much is honest and tells people everything, and their whole mantra of their business and everything they do is built on sharing what you're thinking with people. I mean, obviously there's a point where that can become challenging, right? But that's their culture, and it's radical honesty. But I think the more you move to that situation, the more you can start opening up and building trust with people. Because the challenge is when people think about oversharing, sure, that can happen. But when you think about it and how you accelerate trust with people is by being vulnerable. And most people think I have to trust you to be vulnerable, but it's the exact opposite. I have to be vulnerable, and then I can accelerate trust. And the fastest way to do that is through self-disclosure and sharing experiences and emotions and things that are going on with you. Because then even if you're an acquaintance with someone, you can get really close to them, right? And an example would be, you've both met people in your life within 5 or 10 minutes that you felt like you've either known your entire life or known exceptionally well. And what happened in that conversation, if we had a video of it, would be someone shared something probably pretty small that was vulnerable. And then you shared something else. Maybe it was where you grew up or where you went to school or something you did. And then someone else shared something vulnerable. And you stair-step this up to the point where within that 5 or 10 minutes, you move that conversation where most people would have moved it, you know, into 20th, 30th interaction. Yeah. And so you accelerated that process, and only through sharing can we do that. Because sure, it can be event driven, right? You could have a health scare, you could share a near death experience with people, but those are all things outside of your control. But the one thing it is your mouth, right? And the other way I look at it is that I had a friend tell me once, I was doing a speech. He was like, something I just thought about was, until you tell someone that you love them and you say the words, it doesn't matter what you do, they never know.
Yeah.
And it's saying those words crystallizes your actions and makes it real. And without it, they'll never know, and they'll always wonder. And you can never have an extraordinary relationship with someone until you say those 3 words, I love you. And it really hit home to me on how little people know about us and what to do. I was doing an exercise for the Oklahoma City Thunder basketball team, the operations side of the business. And I asked the president of the operation before we played this exercise and game I created, you know, how well do you know the people in this room and people at your table? And he said, really well, or, you know, and I think most people would probably, who's running something, would think that they do. And I told him, I said, by the end of this, you're going to tell me that you don't know anyone in this room.
Yeah.
And that's what happened, right? I mean, and the guy was very open and candid and nice and everything else. And you could see he cared about people and everyone else. So that part of it, but it opened your eyes at how little we ask questions and how little we know the people around us. So I think it's that sharing that allows you to build those deep connections, which allows people to do their greatest work and then essentially do the impossible in your life. And the same thing goes on finding the best team you've ever been on, right? Whether that's with one other person or many, right? If you could the rest of your life have that kind of feeling and belief and results, like you'd be like, that would be magic, right? It'd be lightning in a bottle everywhere you went. But it's not, because we don't know how to build it. And that becomes the challenge today, I think, in today's business and corporate world, is really how do you build those teams? Because we do nothing by ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, period.
Yeah. So you briefly brought it up, but Cards Against Mundanity. Can you talk about that, what it is, how the game works?
Yeah. So one of the things when I was working, you know, with my clients is really how to build effective teams, because the challenge ends up being is they're managing people, whether it's up, down, sideways, outside the organization, you know, customers, prospects, or partners, and they don't know what to do, and they don't know how to go about it. And I found as though when you teach people to do things, if they don't have a foundation level built of someone with a lot of trust as one of the key components with it, it just doesn't work that well. And when you have a high level of trust from someone, that's where the magic lies. And you don't need to be perfect anymore, because people treat you differently because they know you care about them and what happens to them. And so I was looking around for a way to try to make this real, and I came across a study by Professor Arthur Aaron back in 1997, and he was getting people together to try to figure out how to build closeness and intimate relationships. And he had 54 grad students. He got together in a room, and they were asking each other questions, just 36 questions over 45 minutes. These questions are pretty vulnerable. Like, one of the last questions was, tell me 3 things that you like about me. And that's pretty hard when you don't know someone, and to give them that answer and to share that piece of information. But to me, what was pretty insane was that they did a survey pre and post, and 30% of the people said that they had ended up building the closest relationship of their life after going through 45 minutes of this. And he replicated it dozens and dozens and dozens of times across geography and everyone else. And so I thought that was really interesting. I didn't really believe it at the time. So even though it was written down, I was like, okay, I still want to test it. So I got an acquaintance of mine that was a good acquaintance, get together 7 friends and got to dinner. And I used those exact questions. And I figured we'll see how this actually works. And so I got people together, and, I ran through about 13 of the questions, through an hour. And then I was like, hey, I got to go. I got to meet some other friends. And literally people grabbed me by my jacket and told me I couldn't leave because I had to know what the other, 23 questions were. And I had to go through them with it. So we stood there for like over 3 hours and went in a circle, and people shared super vulnerable things with each other. And some of the people knew each other well. Some of the people didn't. And I was super shocked. And after I did this 2 other times in a row and had the same thing happen 3 times, I was like, there's something here, right? There is something in sharing in groups of people and their experiences and emotions that you can't really replicate in what all happened. And people want to know things, and they want to have deep, meaningful connections. And then the next thing that happened, I was doing this in a small business. And, the day before I was doing it, I didn't realize that the company was in a really bad situation. And they had some people, specifically 2 women that were core to the business, who hated each other. It was like Superman and Kryptonite.
Yeah.
And, they just didn't get along. And they tried everything to get them to reconcile. So we played the game, and I asked them a question. One of the last questions that went around in the group was, tell me about the biggest loss you've had in the last 5 years. And, one of them said their dog. One of them said their mom. Yeah. Obviously not the same thing, but the emotional connection, which I didn't understand at that time, was so strong that they walked out of the room and they were talking about the question. That's how I knew which one it was. They went to lunch later in the week, and 30 days later, they were social friends.
That's awesome.
And imagine anyone you know in your life, if you hate, that in 30 days, you would become good friends and do things by choice outside of work. And as I saw that unfold of doing other stuff, I was like, there's something really here that can teach people things and help them in their own performance and abilities. And so essentially I took this game. Now 12,000 people have gone through it, from Google to Amazon, Southwest Airlines to Gillette to Merck. I mean, tons of companies and smaller ones too. And it's a group game. And what happens is you go and ask a question, and everyone answers it. And it's a very vulnerable question. Questions like, what's the most important lesson you've learned in the last year? What are you most grateful for? Who's your personal hero and why? And other things that really get in the nitty gritty of who people are, where they've come from, what they value, what hurdles they've had in their life, what setbacks. So essentially what you can do is you will learn things about someone that would take 10 or 20 years in minutes.
Yeah.
And when you do that in a group of people, on average, I'm seeing, double digits and more of, metrics increase and other things go on, and, teamwork go better than ever before, just because people know each other better, right? And a lot of times all these false stories and things we make up about each other, then they're dispelled, because when they're in that group, they're hearing information that's like, well, if that's true, how can what I thought about that person be true? Both can't be.
Yeah.
And so the direct evidence you get. And then the other thing is people love to talk about themselves and share and open up, right? And they just don't have a vehicle today to really have deep, meaningful conversations with people. And, you know, that's a I think a significant problem. But if you don't have this, it's hard to work well, right? You two work well together because you know each other well. You trust each other. You've been vulnerable, right? Like that's how it goes. But without that, you wouldn't have the relationship you have. You wouldn't have the success of the show. I mean, onwards, right? So
Yeah.
that's really the key component.
Well, there's obviously a difference between going to like a ropes course and doing a trust fall and actually having a conversation and talking about situations and talking about
Completely agree. That's the problem.
personal things, you know, and most people, you know, like if I was in an office environment and had to go through a course like that where, you know, hey, okay, we're gonna catch you if you fall, you know, it's like everyone kind of just rolls their eyes and like, let's get this day over with. But when you start developing those deep conversations with someone and having a personal relationship with them, that takes it to a whole nother level. That takes it where you're concerned about the person and you want to check up with them. You want to, you know, I don't know, instead of just doing lip service, you're actually getting content and you're getting i- that one-on-one relationship that's
Well,
critical.
yeah, I think that one of those factors, you know, or maybe the most important factor is just sort of that empathy. You know, the
Yes.
fact of the matter is you care about that person like for reals. Like we're not just, you know, saying it, you know, because so many people, you know, especially, you know, my business does a lot of consulting around relationship building and things like that as well. And one of the things we run into a lot is like what he was talking about with like sort of lip service, you know, especially in marketing and advertising these days. Everybody is user experience, user journeys, you know, all this stuff, but like almost nobody is putting their, you know, money where their mouth is. Almost everybody is, you know, collecting data or using something to try and trick you or deceive you into having a relationship with
Yes.
them versus having some kind of, you know, real life authentic relationship, not some manufactured experience. And so I think that authenticity, and I think that the empathy for others, you know, that you can develop in a coaching session like what you're describing or at dinner with your friends is, you know, infinitely more valuable than, you know, the situation that Mike just described. And so I think that that's one of the things, and I think it's honestly what makes the difference is, you know, and it goes back to your points about vulnerability and everything else, is you actually have to give a damn. You can't be kidding about it, you know, and that will resonate and people will understand.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the kind of the core of building these relationships.
You know, I think it's even having this conversation, right? I mean, I go on a lot of podcast shows, and most of it feels a lot of canned, like they're like asking me questions, and there's very little dialogue. Like, you know, for every 50 shows I go on, there's like one like this, and so I mean,
Thank
and
you.
I think this is like, I mean, it's not like I would say. I mean, I'd say this, and if I were on other shows, I would tell the host that too. I mean, I think having this conversation is real, and people come away from it, and it's like actually meaningful because there's an actual dialogue and there are people having a real conversation about real things that matter and not about some trend or traits or what do I think about leadership itself, or getting into experiences and stuff. And I think that's what people want. When you talk, you know, I've been on the road speaking a lot and I talked to a lot of introverts and I've been asking people if they're introvert or extrovert. And I asked them, I said, so if you could have meaningful conversations with people, would you have more of them? And almost all of them say the same thing to me. The problem is not that we don't want to interact with people. It's that we don't want to have the bullshit small talk to get to the meaningful things. And we don't know how to get there. And so it's tiring for us because of who we are to go through that. So we just opt out. We opt out because we'd rather not go through that, right? And so they're missing out because we're not having meaty conversations. And I think that really is telling because I think everyone wants to get to a conversation like this where they're sharing, they're opening up, they're being themselves. People are talking, people are listening, and it's going back and forth. We just don't have those opportunities today, and they're not being set up. And in business and management leadership, they're not actually instigating it from the top down, which is the problem.
Yeah. So we operate out of a co-working center, and I've been just kind of in my side. I've been reading a book that kind of goes over co-working and like best practices and stuff like that. One of the things they recommend is like arranging lunches with people in the center. So like, hey, Steve just went to lunch. You should go join him, or this and that. And then having that person that's kind of pushing you into those situations you wouldn't really go into is critical. And having the sense of community and having the, go grab a beer with him, or, whatever, just having that there is important. How would you, say you've got that coworker that you say hi to in the hall, doesn't, no response, no nothing, or always has headphones on, and striking up the initial conversations hard or rough. Do you have any suggestions for that, for someone, like if you're trying to get to know someone better and you're just kind of acquaintances?
The initial icebreakers.
Yeah. I need a date
Yeah.
this weekend, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think what you said is really important, because when you have a connection to something and it's meaningful, right, in the co-working space that you just mentioned, well, the reason you do that is because another co-working space could come up 3 blocks down, but the reason you won't leave is the people that are there, because you'll be missing those connections. And even if the co-working space is cheaper, you'll pay more to keep those connections, and you won't leave unless it's so much cheaper. I was reading a study where they were offering employees 10 or 15% more salary. And if people loved their coworkers and loved their manager, they wouldn't leave unless it was more money than that, right? So, and it's not even what they were doing, it's the people around them. And so that's the important thing is to take away from that, is you've got to create that connection, a bond. But if I'm with someone I don't know, I start asking them questions that can get at things that are meaningful and that they care about themselves, because then they'll love to talk about it, right? So ask questions like, so what are you most excited about in your life right now? Because that will tell you what they care about. And if they say nothing, well, they're boring, and pretty much write them off, because then they have nothing, right? I mean, like, you can't work with nothing, right? That's the only thing about this doesn't work. But I would ask them, like, so who's your personal hero, or who's the person that's influenced you the most growing up, right? I mean, questions like, what are you most grateful for?
Questions.
Yeah, what are you most grateful for?
How's the weather?
No, because you don't need to, right? Because in my small groups, and I was playing and I've been doing this, I test it out. And sometimes I'll have sort of dip your toe in the questions. I call them more conversation starters. Like, who's your, if you had one superpower, which one would you want? Or things of that nature. And then getting into more deeper questions. And then I've tested out just going into deeper questions, asking like, what's the most important lesson you've learned in the last year? Yeah. I find that people much rather get into the deeper questions than have the warm-up question. Right. And I was doing it the opposite way, because I thought it'd be easier for them.
Right.
But actually what they want is permission to go in deep, and they'll just keep answering whatever you put in front of them.
Well, and I think that's an terrific point, because like you were talking about earlier, how people sometimes, miss out on a good relationship because they just want to get to the meat of something, or they want to get, to right down to business or whatever. They don't really care about all this other stuff. It's what can you do for me lately, And I think that the point you just made is really valuable when it comes to that kind of thing, because I mean, yeah, you're basically giving them permission. You're also giving them a shortcut, right? They don't have to do all the small talk. We're getting right to the meat. And I feel like it's sort of, maybe it's cultural here in the States, but it's kind of that way in business. People are moving fast, and I think just at like a top level, it's really difficult for people to think, hey, I want to stop and invest in this relationship because I'm just trying to get something done. I'm just trying to get through work so that I can go home tonight. So you really are having to convince them that it's worthwhile to have a relationship with you. And I think by opening on something that's a little stronger than, how's the weather or how you doing is, probably helping feed that, kind of getting people into it and knocking down that bit of, aversion to getting into conversation for fear of this is going to take all day. And then once you're in, everybody wants to talk all day. It's perfect. But
they do
get people past that first hurdle.
Yeah, because when I give salespeople and I work on sales scripts, when I start changing it and start to give them certain questions they can ask, like, what are you most grateful for to ask a prospect or even a current customer, or who's your personal hero, or what are you most excited about? Like, they're closing more and they're opening more deals, because when you get people to feel good about themselves and they can share something deep, they're going to buy more and do more, because it's proven in studies, right? They've shown a study where if you're in a group of people and one person in the group, not the manager, praises somewhere else, performance goes up 30%, right? If only one person does it.
Yeah.
And these things all show it because that's just who we are as human beings, right? I mean, in these little things go a really long ways in creating performance and bonding and relationships with people. And when people tell me they don't have time, I'm like, okay, so if you could tell me the best person you've ever worked with, that if you could work with that type of person all over, they'll talk about it. And I'm like, wasn't it easier to communicate with them? Wasn't it easier to collaborate? Weren't they looking out for you? Wouldn't it be easier to resolve conflicts? Do you realize how much that those 4 things time saves you and how much more successful you'd be? Are you really going to evaporate, like take your success down multiple levels just for expediency? And it's actually taking you a lot longer. It's actually not faster. Yeah. It's slower on the front end, but it's way faster as you go forward, right? And that's the fact of all the successful people you've seen that are investing in this culture stuff, right? And reading it. It's just, there aren't enough success stories at a massive level yet to show that it exists, and there's not enough people leading this charge on the high level in business. There are more and more people that are talking about this, but it's still not something that I think, you know, human resources and other people are really 100% bought into and doing. But I think there will be more, because the results and data and research prove that it works. The challenge is that, like, we want everyone to be vulnerable before we are.
Right.
And the problem is that, like, it doesn't work like that, right? I mean, great conversations and great relationships are built on someone having the lead. And when you're the CEO or a leader of a group, the requirement is you have to be vulnerable and open yourself up. And the faster you do that with people and tell them the truth, the more successful you will be.
Yeah, well, and you know, like,
people don't do it.
One of the things I talk about a lot is sort of unforeseen consequences, you know, and in the 50s and the 60s, you know, business used to be done with a handshake and a smile, and your man's word was enough. Or, you know, I guess in this present society, a man or a woman or anybody's hand would, you know, word would be strong enough. But I think we somehow, you know, maybe in this world of technology, and as technology developed, we started chasing these, you know, data and statistics and trying to optimize and be more and more efficient and all those things. And it sort of did away with the soft skills, like we were talking about earlier, the
phone calls,
the
actually having
part.
You look at, like, even people having a conversation on the telephone, and a lot of people don't even know how to do it these days. Everyone's so used to sending emails or quick messages and, like, one sentence, just get it out of my way quick. And then they're not.
Well, and that's the thing. And so I think, you know, the conversation we're having here is basically, I mean, we've got to train people to just get back to their nature, you know, because right now everybody's busy trying to chase something, you know, the Uber success or the whatever, and they're doing it by the methodology they see in business. And yeah, people are finding that just going back to the way things were and having conversations and having relationships is more meaningful and more valuable. But, like, we almost had to screw it up to understand that, you know,
we need it.
Having the relationships is really the better way to be.
I agree. And that's the problem, is that people, when you talk to, like, the top 1% salespeople, like I've done over the last couple of years, and try to get in their heads, like, they are masters at building trust and rapport and likability with people really fast. But they all do it differently, right? And their way to go about it, but all their roads lead to the same place, which is they're vulnerable, they get other people vulnerable, and they learn a lot of information about the people they do business with. They don't do it in some automated way that's like a robot, right? And people fail to see that over and over and over again, right? Gary Vaynerchuk, like, listen to him talk. He's not some robot. He understands human nature and people, and that's why his business grew as much as it did. It's not because he's the best ever at doing what he did, right? And the more he got out and talked to people, the more cutting edge things that he learned, right? I mean, I had one of my clients a few years ago when I first started executive coaching. I made him go to the TED conference, a big conference, and basically do this, networking with people. And he threw a little gathering with 10 people that he invited, and we did it through someone else as well. And we ordered in crappy wines from Texas, right? Because Texas, there's the wine. Yeah. So out of that, and then he did that by saying, hey, you can have some Texas wine or not. I just wanted to bring something from Texas to you all. And people loved it. And it opened up people to have conversations that they never could have before. And we put a different question in front of everyone else to ask people, And it was amazing. And ended up making now more money out of that TED conference than he did with a business that he ran that's really, really successful here in Dallas for 15 years.
Wow.
In that amount of time. And he got to meet Richard Branson on a private airfield in Wyoming, which was his lifelong goal. And is the #1 person he looked up to, and got to fly in a plane with him for 15 minutes. And it didn't cost him some miles. He didn't have to go to Necker Island. He didn't have to do any charity work.
Yeah.
He just had a real conversation on a plane, which people dream about having. And he got to have it because of meeting people, and someone he knew met there knew someone else that then got him that opportunity. Right. And it just goes to show you that stuff's possible. Yeah.
And yeah, just to put a bow on that, I mean, they'd have never given him that opportunity if they didn't know him, like him, trust him, have a relationship with him. And that was built by his authenticity and the way he treated others and things like that, you know. So,
and you take a risk, right? I mean, I had to get him to go to a conference that he never had gone to before. I had to get him to spend money, not that much, but enough to throw it for 10 people, to order wines and to do things, right? And I mean, that's hard for someone who's putting themselves out there and had not done it before. And in that world, he wasn't a big fish in a small pond. He was extremely small guppy, right, in a massive world that he didn't play in. He was in transportation and shipping. Like, no one knew him there, right? So to do all that was extremely vulnerable, but the results were massive because he did it, right? And he jumped in uncertainty, and he tried to be helpful, and he's contribution mindset, and he got back together, and he had people have meaty conversations in there. And most of the things we did cost really nothing, right? Other than the room itself, and some of the other things cost a little bit, but the other things that were actually the ones that drove the most were the cheapest things that we invested in. And they got the most big bang for the buck.
Well, and that's the thing, right? He spent $3,000 to entertain 10 people, and he made $100,000 in deals out of it. Like, I mean, if you could make that investment, you'd make it every day.
Yeah, well, it's end up going to be probably $300 or $400 million out of this. So it's, you know, pretty massive level, life-changing thing to do with almost really no money at all, right? And anyone, you know, these things you can do right now. Someone can't replicate in those things and do something like that, right? There's a little bit of luck involved, but you can still have a lot more success if you put out there for the long term when you start thinking like this. Because the other thing is that you have things working in your favor, meaning 99% of the people are going to do the opposite, right? Right. So like I go back this, I'll pat you on the back, but like I go on all these podcasts, and like I could send people this show and I could say to them, look, I've been on, you know, probably 300 podcasts, do it this way or some version of this. I bet probably 1% of those people would actually do it. Yeah. Even let's just say just with one person, right? And let's not say with both of you. It really wouldn't matter. And you give the blueprint to people and they won't do it because it requires them to be vulnerable. It requires them to prepare. It requires them to think about these things. It requires them to be open and honest and say things where they may be wrong. They may look like a fool, right? And all those things for people are scary, but that's what great work, that's what meaningful conversations and all this stuff are made of people going to that edge and pushing it and be willing to sit in that place of being uncomfortable and uncertain and looking like maybe I'm an idiot, right? And people just aren't willing to do that.
So,
does that make sense?
It does, yeah. In kind of closing here, we're getting to that point.
Sure.
You actually were a speaker at a TED Talk, I think in Wilmington, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you talk about that process and talk about, you know, preparing for it and the effect that it had on your life afterwards?
So when I went into doing it, I tried to think to myself, how could I take it to corporate America? Because I think the problem is today is the difference is back, you know, 5-6 years ago when it was unique, that was a branding thing to do it on its own. Now it's not. So you've got to think, how can I make this translatable? Because getting on TED.com, which would be massive, is super hard. And I mean, it's less than 1%. And there's a lot of variables that could get you there. So there's no way that you could prepare and hire someone and get someone to guarantee it, right?
Sure.
And so I tried to think, how can I take it from here to there? And part of it then I got in a journey was also, how do I do a how-to speech? Because if you don't do a how-to speech, then it requires you to come up with the tools and other things after you do the speech, which is like a whole other thing on itself, right? Which you could have done outside of this. So I really tried to figure out the content, and then how could I create something, a game, right? Cards of Mundanity came out of this, and I tried to create it all. And then the second thing I did was I found a speaking coach that not only helped people speak at TED conferences, but actually was an executive producer, because that way they could help me figure out what might be the best one I could get into with my current capability, and also things like video production, other things to look for, which also matters because the finished product is all you have, right? And, you know, those things were really helpful in the process. And then I had to do a lot of work. I went through every TED Talk, every location, and I looked at the videos, I looked at all the rest of the things, and then came up with my own spreadsheet on the places I should apply to and try to get into. And then I pushed it as far as I could. And, you know, that's what I ended up doing. But it was a massive amount of time from front to back. And if I wouldn't have thought about the corporate capability or the business setting, or how can I apply it to make money at the end, right? Like, if you want to look at it like that, I don't think it works near as well today in today's crowded world. And it's not really worth it. I wouldn't recommend someone that they do it unless they have something like that, like I do a how-to speech. And it's also the rarest one. When I went and did it, there was someone that spoke on like culture and teamwork, and they came after me. And my friends that were there, and yeah, they're my friends, but I do think they did tell me the truth, that they felt that felt flat and they didn't know how to apply it, right?
Oh.
And that's the problem with most TED Talks, right? It's like, you have a great concept, but then how do I actually make it real? Well, buy my program for $4,000 and I'll tell you how to implement it.
Right.
Well, right, I gave you everything out of the speech, the game and everything, and people actually got to experience it and look at a question. And so I can make it real for them. And that way it also helped my speech come to life, because they could feel it in the room and not just conceptualize it. So I tried to think about the biggest impact that I can make positively, and then also how can I make it translatable into money or next steps, or even just a better way to help my clients as part of my engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's yeah, pretty cool. Well, hey, we got to wrap this thing up. Jason, where can people find out more about you, your book, everything online?
Sure, you can go to jasontreu.com. It's jasontreu.com. And then, you know, Cards Against Mundanity is on that site, or if you just Google Cards Against Mundanity, you can download the game for free. And soon there will be physical playing cards available. I'm in the final stages of working with the publisher and designer to start selling real cards that people can play on the PDF version of it. And then my book's on Amazon, Social Wealth, so you can get it right there. And, you know, all the goodness coming out of it.
Well, God, I could let this conversation go on forever. This is super cool, and it's been super valuable, I think, for me personally, but also for, you know, our listeners and everybody that tuned into the video. So thanks so much for taking the time. Really grateful, and yeah, we'll do it again sometime.
Yep. Thanks for having me on the show, guys.
Not a problem. Have a great weekend.
Yep. Take care. Thanks so much.